And I'd like to now kind of open it up for questions, dialogue, and discussion about some of the things I've talked about and some of the concerns that you have. So, Casey?
There's recently I've run two questions. One, I don't do television anymore, so my news is NPR and Foreign Policy magazine, so how misled am I? And then the second question is, there is an idea that NATO, by having outsiders in Europe, provided a generation of peace where the French didn't have to worry about the Germans because all the NATO troops were there and vice versa. Should we take as an indicator of success that there's a NATO presence to subdue the divisions that are in these countries?
Well, let me take the first questions on your news sources. I'm not sure any one source is that good. And NPR, with many other news outlets, is very limited in the number of international reporting that takes place. And Foreign Policy magazine tends to be has articles and analyses written by what I would consider a narrow band of kind of beltway banded elites in Washington. If you look on the internet, a friend of mine showed me a wonderful video that I think it's on a website called TED. And what it does is it analyzes, Barb knows what I mean, it analyzes the news coverage that has taken place kind of internationally, and it has this nice picture of the world globe, and it shrinks countries according to the number of news stories they have or expands them. And the one sample they took for 2007, they list a whole bunch of horrible things that happened in the world. You know, people dying, major earthquakes, everything's like that. Let's see if I get this right. Do you know what the most covered story in the world on the major kind of news outlets was?
Charlie Sheen?
What? No, not 2007.
Oh, 2007.
2007.
We mentioned mission accomplished.
No.
What is the mission? What was the mission?
No, it was not. The most. I'm trying to remember the name of this star. Who was the?
Did that accomplish the overthrow?
No. 2007, the most widely covered news story that people had was the death of that. I'm blanking on her name. She died in the Caribbean. It was the blonde star that had the breast enhancements. What was her name? Anna Nicole Smith's death was by far the most covered story that year. So if you're relying, I don't care if you're relying on NPR or Foreign Policy, which may be better, than Entertainment Tonight, right? But the most covered news story was that. The second part is, the NATO kind of experience, I think, is maybe more limited to kind of Europe, and I'm not sure how much you can extrapolate from that. And remember, NATO troops and NATO peacebuilding efforts are being used now in Afghanistan, particularly in the northern part of the country. And I think they face some of the same kind of challenges that others are. So I'm not sure sort of a NATO spirit or problems, or I'm not sure you can take that example and go too far with it. Casey?
I'm looking at the Afghan Center for Socioeconomic and Opinion Research website. They don't have the survey that I find cited by a Afghan-American woman named Sonali Khatar, that November 2010 survey. This outfit is hired by the same news media you were just decrying to do surveys there.
I like surveys.
In your items of how things, indicators, basically, I'll call them. You didn't mention public opinion, though, of the Afghan people.
Yeah, only once.
The U.S. has hit a all-time low of 43% approval by Afghans, according to this outfit. Again, they don't have it on their own website yet. So that's one thing. The other thing is detention practices. You said was a general indicator, and you mentioned the ACLU. The ACLU is actually quite searingly. Jonathan Hayfetz, I'll recommend. He's been doing on-the-ground studies of U.S. practices in Bagram, so it's not the Afghans' detentions that... detentions are the second grievance that the Afghan people have after the airstrikes. the ACLU calls it inhumane and unlawful detention practices, and he was on the ground just last year. So I wanted you to react to that. I actually didn't hear, thought I was listening closely. I didn't hear anything about the Afghans themselves in your address.
Okay, well, yeah. Here's my defense. In my book, I actually, among the number of indicators that my co-author and I talk about when you look at any kind of peace operation is various public opinion surveys of what you'd use. Because if you were evaluating, for example, aspects of the rule of law, you have to have confidence in that rule of law system in order for it to operate properly. That means that people have to be willing to use it, and they have to be willing to accept that the outcomes that come from that system are legitimate. And the best way in many ways to get at that is to ask the people involved, because if they don't have any faith in the system, they won't use it and they won't follow it. They were more willing to resort to violence if that doesn't take place. So I'm actually a big fan on a number of ways of public opinion survey, not exclusively, but to do that. I deliberately stayed away from indicators of actions that take place by American forces concerning the rule of law, local governance, and other kind of things like that. Those would be legitimate kinds of indicators in a different way, but I was looking at things where there would be agreed upon standards among different kind of stakeholder groups.
Yes. Thanks for giving us an interesting framework in which to look at the question. Could I and urge you to use that? How would you evaluate the potential of achieving those things in either country, either Iraq or Afghanistan, given the leadership that's there now? Both countries have some kind of recognized leadership, not mentioning the leaders from this country that you mentioned. Would you help us understand how likely leaders in either country are likely to move us in the direction that you're speaking about?
Right. Well, first let me say I'm not an expert on the internal politics of either Afghanistan or Iraq, and somebody who would be a better judge than I am on that. Second is we have leaders in each of those countries, but of course I've said ultimately the success is in the long run, and one might guess that President Karzai or various prime ministers in Iraq are not necessarily going to be around 3, 4, or 5 years from now. So in some ways we're making a speculative judgment in the short term in order to project for the long term, which is something I said don't do, right? But you have to anyway. So with those kind of caveats in mind, if you look at President Karzai as the individual necessary to facilitate